Have you ever laid in bed at night exhausted from the day, yet your mind refuses to rest? Thoughts keep circling, things you should have done, things you fear might happen tomorrow, memories that suddenly resurface out of nowhere. The body longs for sleep, but the mind is restless, tangled in its own endless web. This silent storm inside us is something most people never speak about. On the outside, life looks normal. We smile, we work, we chase goals. But within, there is a hidden burden, a weight that keeps pressing, though no one else can see it. The truth is, much of our suffering doesn't come from the world outside, but from the noise inside our own minds. We suffer not because life is inherently unbearable, but because we make it complicated. We build layers upon layers of expectation, desire, fear, and comparison, until our inner world becomes heavier than any external struggle. It's like carrying an invisible backpack everywhere we go. Each worry adds a stone. Each desire adds another. Every comparison, every what if, every fear of losing what we cling to, it all piles up. The weight grows and we wonder why happiness feels so far away. Yet deep down, we all long for the same thing, peace. A life where the heart feels light, where joy flows naturally, where silence is not frightening but comforting. But here lies the paradox. We search for peace in more success, more possessions, more approval, more distractions. And the more we chase, the heavier our minds become. The Buddha once described this so clearly. He said that suffering begins not in the world itself, but in craving. Craving multiplies our thoughts, complicates our emotions, ties knots in the fabric of our being. And when the mind is knotted, no matter how beautiful the world outside is, we cannot feel its beauty. Imagine for a moment a lake. If the water is muddy and stirred, it doesn't matter how bright the sky is above, it cannot be reflected clearly. Our mind is the same. The sky of happiness has always been there, waiting, but the mud of endless thoughts prevents us from seeing it. There is a reason why we feel restless even in moments when everything seems fine. It's because happiness is not in the next thing we achieve. It is in the simplicity of a mind that can rest in this very moment. A mind uncluttered, unburdened, free. But the question remains, why do we complicate our minds in the first place? Why do we hold on so tightly to the very thoughts that hurt us? Perhaps it is because we've been taught since childhood that more is always better. More success equals more happiness. More possessions equal more worth. More recognition equals more love. But life has a way of proving the opposite. Think of the happiest moments in your life. Were they filled with excess? Or were they simple? A laugh shared with someone you love, a quiet walk at sunset, the taste of tea on a calm morning. Happiness doesn't arrive in noise. It arrives in simplicity. And yet in the modern world, silence feels almost unbearable. The moment things get quiet, we reach for our phones, scroll endlessly, or seek the next distraction. We are afraid to face the simple stillness of our own minds. Why? Because the clutter inside has become so loud that silence feels threatening. But here is the hidden truth. The very silence we avoid is the doorway to freedom. When the mind becomes simple, life becomes light. When the clutter dissolves, happiness no longer hides. The simpler the mind, the happier the life. This journey is not about withdrawing from the world, nor is it about rejecting joy. It is about discovering that the deepest joy comes not from adding more, but from letting go. The art of simplicity is the art of living fully. So, as we begin exploring this path together, let us pause and reflect. What would life feel like if the weight you carry inside could suddenly be lifted? What if peace was not something to chase, but something already here, hidden beneath the clutter of thought? That question is where our journey truly begins. If you stop for a moment and listen to your own thoughts, you might notice something surprising. The mind almost never sits still. Even in silence, it is busy. It leaps from one memory to another, one fear to another, one desire to another, like a restless monkey jumping from branch to branch. This is what Buddhist teachers call the monkey mind, always unsettled, always searching, never content. But why does it behave this way? Why is the mind so restless, so complicated? At its root, complication arises from attachment. We cling to the past, replaying what has already happened, trying to fix what cannot be changed. We cling to the future, imagining every possible outcome, worrying about scenarios that may never even occur. And in between, we cling to the present, trying to control what cannot be fully controlled. Each attachment is like a string. Over time, the strings multiply until the mind becomes like a tangled ball of knots. The more we pull, the tighter it gets. This is why the mind feels heavy, because it is entangled with everything it refuses to let go of. Think about how often the mind compares. We compare our lives to others, our looks, our achievements, even our happiness. The moment we compare, we create division, me versus them, success versus failure, better versus worse. And once that division exists, the mind begins chasing, competing, fearing. Or consider how often the mind creates stories. Something small happens, a word, a glance, a mistake, and immediately the mind spins a whole narrative. They don't like me, I'm not good enough, this always happens to me. Suddenly, the story feels more real than the event itself. The mind has turned a single drop into an ocean. This is the nature of the complicated mind. It magnifies, multiplies, dramatizes. Instead of simply experiencing life, it overlays life with endless commentary. Instead of resting in the moment, it runs away into 1,000 imagined worlds. The Buddha compared this to a man shot by an arrow. Instead of simply treating the wound, he obsesses. Who shot me? Why did they do it? What kind of arrow is this? Was it poison? All the while, the real suffering comes not from the arrow itself, but from the endless thoughts about the arrow. In modern life, we see this everywhere. A minor problem at work turns into days of stress. A single negative comment online echoes louder than 100 words of kindness. One fear about money spirals into visions of total collapse. The problem itself may be small, but the mind multiplies it until it feels unbearable. And yet, most of us believe this is normal. We think that's just how the mind works. But Buddhist wisdom shows us something deeper. The mind was not born complicated. Like a clear sky, it is naturally spacious and bright. The complexity we feel is something learned, something layered on through habits of craving, fear, and ignorance. Picture a child laughing freely. Their mind is simple. They don't worry about tomorrow or replay yesterday. They are fully alive in the moment, curious and open. But as life goes on, layers of complexity are added, expectations from family, pressures from society, fears of rejection, desires for more. By adulthood, the simple sky is covered with clouds. The tragedy is not that the sky is gone, it never left. It's just hidden. Beneath the restless thoughts, the mind is still simple, still pure, still capable of joy. Our task is not to create peace, but to uncover it. But here is where many people struggle. If simplicity is natural, why is it so hard to return to? Because the complicated mind is seductive. It makes us feel important when we overthink. It makes us feel safe when we prepare for every possible outcome. It makes us feel valuable when we accumulate possessions or chase achievements. In truth, it is a trap disguised as progress. And so, the more we trust the complicated mind, the further we drift from happiness. We think we are building security, but really, we are building walls. We think we are gaining freedom, but really, we are tightening chains. To see this clearly is the first step to freedom. When we recognize the restless, tangled nature of the complicated mind, we begin to question it. Do I really need all these thoughts? Do I really need to carry all this weight? Is happiness really waiting at the end of more, or could it be waiting in less? The answers are not found in thinking harder. They are found in looking deeply, in observing the patterns of the mind without judgment. This gentle awareness is what begins to untangle the knots. And once we start untangling, something shifts. We begin to notice how craving fuels our thoughts. We see how comparison poisons our peace. We feel how fear multiplies suffering. And in that seeing, a new possibility arises, the possibility of simplicity. It is here that the path begins to open. Because to understand why we suffer is also to glimpse how we can be free. Have you ever noticed how quickly contentment slips through your fingers? You achieve something, maybe a promotion, a new gadget, or a moment of recognition, and for a brief moment you feel joy. But almost instantly the mind starts whispering, "What's next? How can I do better? How do I compare?" This is the subtle yet relentless trap of desire. We are taught to seek more, to reach higher, to accumulate endlessly. And in that pursuit, happiness becomes elusive, always just out of reach. Buddhism calls this craving, or tanha. It is the root of suffering, not because having things is inherently bad, but because the mind ties its sense of worth to what it possesses or achieves. Desire turns a simple life into a complicated one, because once we have, the mind immediately wants more. Comparison intensifies this trap. We glance at someone else's life, on social media, at work, even in our community, and our hearts tighten. Why do they have what I don't? Why am I behind? Why is their life seemingly easier, happier, fuller? Each comparison is a small seed of dissatisfaction, and when planted repeatedly, it grows into a forest of discontent. We don't even realize how much of our mental energy is spent measuring ourselves against others. How we look, how we succeed, how we are perceived. These are the silent metrics by which the mind evaluates itself every day, and every evaluation brings tension, worry, and craving. The more we chase more, the further we drift from peace. The irony is stark. We believe that more will fill the emptiness, but in truth, it only stretches it. Imagine trying to fill a cup with water, but every time it overflows, you make the cup bigger instead of stopping to notice it was already full. This is the trap of the mind. Desire also fractures the present moment. While chasing what's next, we fail to live what's already here. That quiet morning, that genuine smile from a loved one, that peaceful breath. These simple gifts go unnoticed because the mind is too busy grasping at the next thing. But there is hope. Buddhism teaches that freedom lies in awareness. When we notice desire and comparison without immediately reacting, we start to loosen their grip. When we see that wanting more is not a necessity but a habit, we can begin to choose differently. This is not about rejecting ambition or joy. It is about understanding that true joy does not depend on accumulation. True happiness is not found in surpassing others, but in being fully present with ourselves. It is found in simplicity, in letting go of the endless chase. Think of a traveler carrying two heavy backpacks. One is full of items they truly need. The other is stuffed with just-in-case things, comparisons, fears, and desires. The more they carry, the slower and more exhausted they become. And yet, the path is still there, ready to be walked lightly. The wisdom lies in setting down what is unnecessary. Stories of simplicity abound in Buddhist teachings. There are monks who own nothing yet live with radiant contentment. They do not chase wealth, recognition, or approval. Their happiness does not depend on the world outside. It flows naturally from a mind that is uncluttered and free. And here's the subtle, life-changing truth. Letting go of desire doesn't make life dull. It makes life vivid. When the mind is not constantly grasping, it notices beauty that was always present. The laughter of children, the warmth of sunlight, the calm of a quiet moment. Happiness is not in more, but in noticing what already exists. The challenge, of course, is that the mind resists simplicity. It whispers, "If I let go, I'll miss something. If I stop chasing, I'll fall behind." But the paradox is that letting go of the chase is what allows you to actually arrive. Only when the mind rests in simplicity can joy reveal itself fully. Comparison and desire are powerful teachers. When we see them clearly without judgment, we begin to understand the mechanics of suffering. And understanding is the first step toward freedom. Because once we recognize the trap, we can start walking a different path. A path that leads not outward toward more, but inward toward peace. In the quiet that follows desire and comparison, the mind begins to breathe. The invisible weight begins to lift. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, we discover that the happiness we have been chasing was never in the next achievement or possession. It has been within us all along, waiting for a mind simple enough to notice it. This is where the journey deepens, Because once we start to loosen the grip of desire and comparison, the door opens to a richer understanding of what life truly offers. A life not cluttered by constant striving, but illuminated by clarity and ease. There is a quiet beauty in simplicity, a profound elegance that often goes unnoticed in the rush of daily life. And nowhere is this more apparent than in the teachings of the Buddha. For centuries, Buddhist wisdom has reminded us that the mind's true nature is clear, spacious, and free. Yet we complicate it with endless desires, attachments, and worries. The Buddha didn't preach renunciation for the sake of suffering. He taught it as a way to uncover what is already present: peace, clarity, and joy. Imagine a monk sitting by a quiet river with only the clothes on his back and a simple bowl. There is no fear in his heart, no longing for more, no envy of others. And yet if you asked him whether he is happy, he would smile and say yes, not because of what he has, but because he has let go of what he does not need. This is the essence of simplicity, freedom from the unnecessary. It is not poverty or deprivation. It is a conscious choice to see what truly matters. The Buddha called it santutthi, contentment, a state where the mind rests, no longer pulling in every direction, no longer burdened by cravings or comparisons. Zen masters often illustrate this with a simple metaphor: the empty cup. When a cup is full, nothing else can enter. But when it is empty, it can receive water, tea, or whatever is offered. Likewise, when the mind is cluttered, it cannot experience life fully. Simplicity empties the cup, not to take away, but to make space for the richness of the present moment. Buddhist teachings also show us that simplicity is inherently joyful. There is a freedom in having fewer attachments, in desiring less, in letting go. When we release the constant need for more, we discover that life is not about accumulation, it is about presence. A simple mind notices the warmth of the morning sun, the subtle fragrance of flowers, the laughter of a child. These are the treasures that never fade, yet they are invisible to a mind caught in the trap of more. There is a story of a monk walking through a bustling village. He carries nothing but a small bowl. People laugh at him, thinking he is poor, lacking, or weak. But he walks lightly, each step peaceful, each breath calm. At night, when others lie awake, worried about wealth, status, or reputation, he sleeps deeply. His mind is simple, and that simplicity is his true wealth. Simplicity, the teachings tell us, is also a path to wisdom. A complicated mind obscures clarity. It clouds judgment with fear, pride, and desire. But a simple mind sees things as they are. It perceives reality clearly, without the distortions of craving or aversion. This clarity allows us to act wisely, to respond to life with compassion, and to move through the world with ease. Modern life often tempts us in the opposite direction. We are bombarded with advertisements, messages, social media updates, news alerts, endless information demanding attention. Each distraction adds weight to the mind, pulling it further from its natural simplicity. Buddhist teachings remind us that happiness does not come from more information, more things, or more approval. Happiness comes from a mind that knows how to let go. Simplicity is not a static state. It is a practice, a daily choice. Every time we choose not to overthink, every time we resist the pull of comparison, every time we notice desire without being consumed by it, we practice simplicity. Each act is like sweeping dust from a mirror. Gradually, the reflection becomes clear and we see the world as it truly is. And there is a subtle magic in this clarity. When the mind is simple, we experience life more vividly. Colors seem brighter, sounds more distinct, relationships more genuine. We no longer live in a fog of craving and comparison. Instead, we inhabit the present with attention and gratitude. Simplicity transforms the ordinary into something extraordinary. Ultimately, the beauty of simplicity in Buddhist teachings is not about rules or restrictions. It is about awakening to the truth that the mind is naturally sufficient. The treasures we seek externally already exist within when the mind is uncluttered. The joy we chase is always present, waiting for a heart simple enough to notice. And as we begin to embrace this simplicity, we begin to see a profound connection between ourselves and the world. Life does not need to be complicated. The moments we overlook, the quiet pauses, the spaces between breaths, these are the threads that weave a life of peace, clarity, and happiness. Simplicity is not a distant goal. It is a practice available right now in every moment, in every breath. It is the art of noticing what is, letting go of what isn't, and resting in the richness of what remains. And in this resting, the mind discovers a freedom it has never known, a freedom that does not require more, a freedom that reveals that the happiness we have been searching for outside ourselves has been inside all along. For centuries, Buddhist sages have taught that simplicity of mind leads to peace, clarity, and happiness. But today, science is catching up with what they have known all along. Modern research in psychology and neuroscience reveals that a cluttered mind is not just tiring. It can literally affect our brain, body, and emotional well-being. When the mind is overwhelmed with constant thoughts, comparisons, and worries, the body responds as if under threat. Cortisol, the stress hormone, rises, heart rate increases, muscles tense, sleep becomes restless. Over time, chronic mental clutter can lead to anxiety, depression, and even physical illness. In other words, the complexity of our thoughts doesn't just feel heavy, it makes us heavy. Conversely, studies show that mental simplicity, mindfulness, meditation, and intentional focus has measurable benefits. The brain becomes more flexible, emotions stabilize, and stress diminishes. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for decision-making and self-control, strengthens. Meanwhile, the amygdala, the seat of fear and reactivity, quiets down. The mind literally becomes calmer, clearer, more capable of experiencing joy. Even small practices make a difference. Paying attention to a single breath, noticing sensations without judgment, or focusing fully on one task at a time. These acts simplify the mind. Neuroscientists have found that such focus reduces mental chatter, lowers anxiety, and improves overall well-being. The science is undeniable. A simple mind is a healthier mind. But the wisdom goes deeper than biochemistry. Simplicity allows the brain to function as it was naturally designed. The mind evolved to be attentive, adaptable, and present. Constant distraction, overthinking, and craving pull it away from its natural state. By simplifying, we return to the mind's original design, clear, spacious, and fully alive. Think of it like a lens. When the lens is smudged with fingerprints, the world appears blurry, distorted, and confusing. Once the lens is cleaned, colors become vivid, shapes clear, and light shines through unobstructed. The brain works in the same way. Simplifying the mind removes distortions and allows us to perceive reality as it truly is, rather than through layers of anxiety and desire. Interestingly, research also shows that a simple mind enhances creativity. When thoughts are not tangled in comparison or worry, the mind can make new connections, see fresh perspectives, and respond to challenges with ingenuity. Simplicity doesn't limit life. It expands it, opening doors to insight, compassion, and innovative thinking. And here is a subtle yet profound point. Science confirms what the Buddha taught long ago. Happiness is not found in more possessions, more achievements, more stimulation, but in less clutter, less craving, less distraction. When the mind is simple, it experiences life more fully. Ordinary moments, sunlight on leaves, laughter shared with a friend, a quiet breath become extraordinary. Yet understanding the science is only half the path. Awareness without practice is like knowing the map but refusing to take the journey. Simplicity is not just a concept to admire, it is a practice to live. Meditation, mindful attention, decluttering the mind of unnecessary thoughts. These are the ways we translate the science into real, tangible happiness. Modern life, with its constant notifications, social media updates, and endless choices, challenges simplicity at every turn. But even here, science offers hope. Intentional focus, digital detoxes, and mindful pauses can counteract the mental overload. By taking conscious steps to simplify, we literally rewire the brain to experience peace and clarity more naturally. And when we combine this scientific understanding with the ancient wisdom of Buddhism, something remarkable happens. We see that simplicity is not a restriction, not a sacrifice. It is a liberation. A liberated mind is free to enjoy the world as it is, to connect with others deeply, and to experience the joy that has always been present, waiting beneath the noise. In short, the science of a simple mind confirms what intuition and spiritual insight have long known. Complexity weighs us down, simplicity frees us. The mind, when uncluttered, is radiant, clear, and capable of deep, effortless happiness. And once we see this, we begin to understand how to live differently, not by doing more, but by thinking less, letting go, and allowing life to unfold with a natural ease that the busy mind has long obscured. Simplicity isn't something we stumble upon, it's something we nurture. Just as a garden grows when cared for, the mind becomes clear and peaceful through deliberate practice. But how do we cultivate this simplicity in the chaos of everyday life? The first step is awareness. We must begin by noticing the patterns that complicate our mind. When a thought arises, a worry about the future, a sting of envy, a craving for something, we observe it without judgment. Ah, here is desire, we might say. Here is comparison. Awareness doesn't fight these thoughts, it simply sees them. Like clouds drifting across a clear sky, thoughts come and go and the mind begins to breathe again. Meditation is one of the most powerful tools for this practice. Sitting quietly, focusing on the breath, and returning again and again to the present moment trains the mind to let go. Each time we release a thought, a knot untangles. Each time we notice without reacting, the mind grows lighter. Over time, the constant storm of mental chatter begins to subside, replaced by a sense of clarity and calm. But meditation alone is not enough. Simplicity thrives in daily life as well. Mindfulness in action, washing the dishes, walking, eating, or even speaking, helps us carry the clarity of meditation into the world. When we move with awareness, our thoughts lose their power to overwhelm us. Each action becomes an opportunity to practice letting go, to release unnecessary tension, and to simplify our mental space. Another essential practice is decluttering, not just physically but mentally. Let go of the just-in-case thoughts, the comparisons, the fears of what others think. Examine what truly matters. Ask yourself, does this thought, this worry, this desire serve my well-being? If not, gently set it aside. Simplicity is not a denial of life, but a choice to release what weighs us down. Gratitude is another doorway to a simple mind. When we focus on what we have rather than what we lack, the mind naturally unclutters itself. A morning spent noticing the warmth of sunlight, the taste of tea, or the presence of a friend can shift the mind from craving to contentment. Gratitude doesn't add complexity. It reveals the simplicity that has been here all along. We can also cultivate simplicity by slowing down. The modern mind races through life, multitasking, juggling responsibilities, and absorbing endless information. By intentionally slowing, pausing between tasks, and savoring moments, we allow the mind to catch up to reality. In the space created by slowing down, simplicity begins to blossom. Storytelling illustrates this beautifully. Imagine a young professional constantly chasing deadlines, scrolling through notifications, comparing themselves to colleagues. One day they decide to take a short walk without their phone, to simply breathe and notice the world. At first, the mind resists, restless with boredom, but gradually they notice the trees, the birds, the rhythm of their own steps. A small smile appears. The mind feels lighter. The weight of endless thought begins to lift. This small step toward simplicity, practiced consistently, transforms life. Another practice is learning to say no, both to things and to thoughts. Not every opportunity, not every desire, and not every worry deserves our attention. By choosing carefully, we protect the clarity of our mind. A simple life is not passive. It is intentional. It is an active cultivation of focus, calm, and presence. Finally, community and teaching can support simplicity. Being around people who value clarity, Listening to teachings of the wise and sharing experiences of mindfulness can reinforce the path. Simplicity flourishes in a supportive environment where the mind sees examples of peace and learns the habits that sustain it. The cultivation of a simple mind is not a one-time achievement. It is a continuous practice, a daily commitment, a gentle turning toward clarity. Each breath, each moment of awareness, each intentional choice peels away the layers of complication. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, life begins to feel lighter, brighter, and more vivid. When we cultivate a simple mind, we do more than reduce stress or gain mental clarity. We open ourselves to joy, to presence, and to connection. We begin to see that happiness has never been in more. It has always been in less, in the uncluttered space of awareness where life unfolds naturally. And as the mind simplifies, we begin to notice its subtle impact everywhere: our relationships, our work, our interactions with the world. Complexity begins to fade, and a new kind of ease takes its place. The stage is now set to explore the stories and examples of this simplicity in action, the ways it transforms lives, hearts, and communities. There is something undeniably powerful about stories. They speak to our hearts, bypassing the mind's chatter and planting seeds of understanding in ways that logic alone never can. And when it comes to simplicity, stories show us not just the concept, but the lived experience, the joy, freedom, and lightness that arise when the mind is uncluttered. Consider the story of an elderly monk in a remote village. He had no possessions beyond his robes, a bowl, and a few books. Yet, every morning he greeted the sun with a smile, moved through the day with gentle care, and slept at night without fear or regret. When asked how he lived so happily with so little, he replied, "I have everything I need. My mind is free." There is a lesson here. Simplicity is not measured by material wealth, but by the freedom of the heart. Or think of a busy urban professional who decided to try something radical. She removed the clutter from her apartment, unsubscribed from hundreds of email lists, and committed to 15 minutes of meditation each day. At first, the emptiness felt strange, even uncomfortable, but gradually she noticed a calm that had been missing for years. Colors seemed brighter, conversations deeper, and even work tasks felt easier to handle. Her life hadn't changed in material terms, but the experience of it had shifted completely. Then there is the story of a farmer in rural Asia. He lived a modest life, working the fields, tending to his animals, and caring for his family. He owned little, yet his days were full of laughter, gratitude, and connection. One day, a visitor asked him why he was always so joyful. The farmer pointed to the sky, the river, and the soil beneath his feet. "Happiness is here," he said. "It's in the life we already have, not in chasing more." Even in the West, similar stories abound. Minimalists who let go of excessive possessions often speak of an unexpected freedom, of a sense of spaciousness in their days that no accumulation of things could ever provide. They describe feeling lighter, more present, and more connected to themselves, to others, and to the world around them. What unites all these stories is a common thread. Simplicity frees the mind to experience life fully. When the mind is not burdened by desire, comparison, or fear, ordinary moments become extraordinary. The laughter of a friend, the warmth of sunlight, the quiet of a starry night, all of it is accessible, vivid, and profoundly satisfying. Buddhist parables further illustrate this truth. There is the story of a monk who, when asked about the secret to happiness, simply poured water into a cup, then poured it out again. The student, confused, asked why. The monk replied, "Empty your cup and life will flow in." The lesson is clear. Letting go, simplifying, and creating space in the mind allows joy, clarity, and freedom to enter naturally. These stories also highlight an important subtlety. Simplicity is not about denying life's richness or avoiding responsibility. It is about choosing wisely, seeing clearly, and releasing what does not serve our well-being. The monk with nothing is not deprived, he is free. The professional who declutters is not lacking, she is more present. The farmer is not poor, he is rich in experience, connection, and gratitude. And there is an infectious quality to this simplicity. One person who embodies it often inspires others. Calm radiates, laughter spreads, and clarity invites others to pause, breathe, and notice. Happiness, once cultivated in a simple mind, naturally touches those around it. The magic of these stories is that they are not extraordinary. They do not require wealth, fame, or special circumstances. They require only a mind willing to let go, to slow down, and to notice. They teach us that joy is not hidden in complexity. It is woven into the simple fabric of life, waiting for a heart open enough to see it. As we witness these examples, the lesson becomes undeniable. Simplicity transforms life. It doesn't just lighten the mind, it changes the way we perceive the world. It allows the ordinary to become sacred, the mundane to become extraordinary, and the present moment to shine with clarity, connection, and contentment. And as we begin to embrace these stories in our own lives, we can see the next step unfolding naturally. Because simplicity does more than create happiness. It shapes the way we relate to others, to our surroundings, and to the deeper currents of life itself. One of the most profound ways simplicity transforms life is in our relationships. When the mind is cluttered with desire, comparison, and fear, interactions with others become fraught. We argue over trivial matters, compete for attention, and carry silent resentment. Every conversation, every connection is filtered through the lens of a complicated mind. But when the mind is simple, relationships shift in subtle and powerful ways. A simple mind does not cling to expectations or judgments. It listens fully, speaks clearly, and responds with presence rather than reaction. Conflict diminishes, understanding deepens, and connections flourish naturally. Consider the story of a father and his teenage daughter. Their home was filled with tension, arguments sparked by small misunderstandings, expectations, and unspoken resentments. One day, the father decided to practice mindful listening. Instead of reacting, he simply focused on understanding his daughter's words and feelings. Over time, the atmosphere at home transformed. Arguments softened, laughter returned, and trust deepened. By simplifying his approach, by calming his mind and letting go of unnecessary assumptions, he changed the relationship entirely. Simplicity also fosters empathy and compassion. When we are not weighed down by our own anxieties and desires, we can truly see and feel the experiences of others. We respond with kindness, patience, and care, rather than with judgment or irritation. The Buddha often emphasized that inner peace radiates outward. A calm, uncluttered mind naturally nurtures harmonious relationships. Even in friendships, simplicity matters. A friend who listens without distraction, who offers presence rather than advice, who shares laughter without expectation, is a friend whose mind is uncluttered. Their presence is a gift, and the bond they create is deep and resilient. Complex minds, on the other hand, bring tension, comparison, and subtle competition, even unintentionally. Romantic relationships, too, thrive on simplicity. When two people meet with open hearts and minds free from unnecessary expectations, the relationship blossoms. Love is not complicated by possessiveness, jealousy, or endless comparison. It flows naturally, effortlessly, like a river moving through an open landscape. But simplicity in relationships doesn't mean passivity or avoidance. It doesn't mean ignoring problems or pretending everything is perfect. It means approaching challenges with clarity, listening with attention, and responding without ego. A simple mind sees clearly what is happening, what is needed, and what can be let go. It chooses action that brings harmony rather than conflict. There's a story of two colleagues who constantly clashed at work. Deadlines, differences in style, and personal pride created friction. One of them decided to practice simplicity, to focus on the task, release personal judgments, and communicate with clarity. Slowly, tension eased. Collaboration improved. Both discovered that by simplifying their minds, they could transform not just their own experience, but the dynamic between them. Relationships, after all, are mirrors. They reflect our own inner clutter. If the mind is tangled with desire, fear, or pride, interactions with others will reflect that complexity. But when the mind is clear, even the most ordinary interactions carry the possibility of connection, joy, and understanding. The beauty of simplicity is that it is contagious. One calm presence can soothe a room. One patient, attentive listener can shift the tone of a conversation. One mind free from comparison can inspire others to do the same. In this way, the simplicity of a single person ripples outward, touching families, friends, and communities. Ultimately, cultivating simplicity in relationships is not just about making life easier. It is about creating space for authentic connection. When we let go of the unnecessary mental noise, we make room for love, understanding, and presence. And in that space, relationships are no longer obligations or tests. They become reflections of the peace, clarity, and joy that reside within the simple mind. And as we see the profound effects of simplicity on our interactions, we begin to notice a larger truth. A simple mind does more than transform our personal life. It reaches outward, creating harmony, radiating calm, and touching the world in ways that are both subtle and profound. Simplicity doesn't stay confined to the individual. A simple mind has a ripple effect. It touches everyone and everything around it, often in ways we don't immediately notice. One quiet presence can shift an entire room. One uncluttered mind can bring clarity to others. The impact of simplicity is subtle, yet profoundly transformative. Consider a teacher in a bustling classroom. Her mind is calm, clear, and attentive. She speaks with patience, listens without distraction, and responds to each child with presence. The students, in turn, mirror her calm. The classroom, once chaotic, now hums with focus, cooperation, and curiosity. Her simplicity has set a ripple in motion, influencing every interaction, every lesson, every mind in the room. Even in families, the effect is visible. A parent who cultivates simplicity, letting go of unnecessary worry, comparison, and anger, creates an environment of calm and trust. Children absorb this. They learn not through instruction but through observation. A simple mind models patience, clarity, and resilience, planting seeds that grow over a lifetime. In workplaces, communities, and friendships, the ripple spreads similarly. One calm, mindful person can inspire cooperation, reduce tension, and foster understanding. Complexity often breeds stress, distraction, and conflict. Simplicity breeds focus, clarity, and harmony. The contrast is striking. One small change in the inner world can lead to sweeping effects in the outer world. There is a story of a nurse in a busy hospital. She carried herself with calm composure despite long shifts, endless responsibilities, and high-pressure situations. Her calm didn't just help her manage stress, it radiated to colleagues and patients alike. Tension eased, mistakes decreased, and even patients reported feeling more at peace. The ripple of her simple mind transformed an entire environment. The ripple effect is not always dramatic or immediate. Sometimes it is subtle, felt in fleeting moments. A conversation that doesn't escalate, a smile that lifts someone's mood, a patient response that inspires another. But over time, these small waves accumulate. Just as a single pebble creates expanding ripples in a pond, the presence of a simple mind reaches farther than we realize. This ripple also touches our inner world in a profound way. As we practice simplicity, we influence not only others but the patterns of our own mind. Calm begets clarity. Clarity begets wisdom. Wisdom begets compassionate action. The mind, once weighed down by complexity, now moves like a clear river, deep, flowing, and resilient. And here is the hidden magic. The ripple is mutual. When others respond to our simplicity with openness, patience, or understanding, our practice deepens. The outer world reflects back the inner calm, reinforcing the cycle. Simplicity does not isolate, it connects. It does not withdraw, it radiates. Science echoes this truth. Research shows that emotions are contagious. Calmness, kindness, and focus can spread through groups, reducing stress and enhancing cooperation. In other words, simplicity is not just spiritual, It has measurable effects on the collective energy of those around us. Yet the ripple effect begins within. We cannot control the world, nor should we attempt to impose calm. Our task is to cultivate clarity, presence, and simplicity in our own minds. When we do, the ripple naturally follows, reaching further than any effort, advice, or instruction ever could. In essence, the ripple of a simple mind is a quiet revolution. It transforms relationships, communities, and environments, not through force but through presence. One uncluttered heart can shift countless others. One mindful breath can change the tone of an entire room. One moment of clarity can ignite insight in someone else. As we witness this ripple, we begin to understand a profound truth. Simplicity is not a private practice. It is a gift, a contribution, a quiet yet powerful influence that flows outward endlessly. And as the ripples spread, the world begins to feel lighter, clearer, and more alive. The stage is now set for the final reflection, where all of these threads, the understanding, the practice, the stories, the relationships, and the ripple, come together. The journey culminates in a realization that simplicity is not just a way of thinking. It is a way of living, breathing, and being fully present in the world. And here we are at the gentle close of this journey, a journey not outward but inward toward the place we have always called home. Simplicity is not somewhere we arrive. It is something we uncover, something that has been waiting quietly beneath the noise, the craving, the endless pursuit. Returning home to a simple mind is like coming back to a clear sky after a storm. The clouds of fear, desire, and comparison drift away, leaving vast, open space. The mind breathes freely. The heart feels lighter. Life, in its ordinary beauty, reveals itself fully. Happiness, as we have discovered, is not hidden in complexity. It is not locked behind achievements, possessions, or recognition. It resides in the present moment, in the uncluttered heart, in the freedom to see clearly and respond naturally. To live simply is to live fully, to participate in life without being pulled under by it. Think of the stories we have explored: the monk by the river, the professional who decluttered her life, the farmer who found joy in his fields, the nurse who radiated calm in a busy hospital. Each reminds us that simplicity is accessible to anyone, anywhere. It requires no special circumstances, no wealth, no extraordinary talent. It requires only a willingness to let go, to notice, and to return to what is essential. Returning home also means embracing the ripple effect of simplicity. The calm we cultivate does not end with us, it flows outward. Every kind word, every patient response, every mindful breath spreads gently into the world, touching lives, easing tension, and inspiring others to find their own clarity. Our personal practice becomes a quiet revolution. And yet, simplicity is not a destination. It is a way of being. It is woven into every breath, every step, every interaction. It is found in pausing to notice the sunlight through the trees, in listening fully to a friend, in savoring the ordinary moments that we often overlook. The beauty of life reveals itself when the mind unclutters and the heart opens. Returning home to simplicity is also a return to ourselves. Beneath layers of worry, desire, and comparison, we discover a mind capable of joy, a heart capable of peace, and a life capable of profound richness. The happiness we sought in external things was always within us, waiting patiently, quietly, for a mind clear enough to recognize it. Buddhism teaches us that the greatest treasures are not found in accumulation, but in release. The lighter the mind, the freer the heart, the simpler the life, the deeper the happiness. And in that simplicity we find a profound harmony with the world, a rhythm that does not demand, that does not cling, that simply flows. So, as we conclude this journey, remember that simplicity is not a loss. It is a gain beyond measure. It is the uncovering of what has always been here. It is the homecoming of the heart. And in this home we are whole, we are free, we are at peace. May we carry this understanding into every day, in every breath, in every moment. May we remember that happiness is not in what we accumulate, but in what we release. That the mind's clarity, the heart's lightness, and the life of presence are the treasures that no one can take away. And as we step back into the world, let us move lightly, speak gently, and live fully, mindful of the beauty, the joy, and the freedom that simplicity offers. In letting go, we return home, and in returning home, we find ourselves truly, deeply, and endlessly happy. If this message resonated with you, if the quiet wisdom of simplicity touched your heart, consider subscribing to Zen Buddhism Wisdom. Here, we explore the teachings of the Buddha, the art of mindful living, and the paths that lead to peace and clarity. Join our community not to seek more, but to notice what is already here, to discover the gentle freedom, the calm presence, and the subtle joy that simplicity brings. And if you feel inspired, share this video with someone who might need a reminder that happiness does not come from more, but from the clarity and lightness of the mind. Together, we can cultivate peace, one mindful moment at a time.